Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're going to get started with some intros before we dive in. So I will start. Hello, I'm Sam Hunter. I am the Education Outreach Manager at the Rhode Island Historical Society, as well as the coordinator for National History Day in Rhode Island. Alyssa, I'll pass it to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Alyssa Tardif. I am Director of Education at the Massachusetts Historical Society and also one of the coordinators of the Massachusetts program with my wonderful colleague, Kate Melchior. Kate, I'll turn it to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Melchior. I also work at the Mass Historical Society and am happy to be joining you all today. And I'll toss it to you, John.
Morning, everyone. My name is John Taylor. I am with the Margaret Chase Smith Library here in Maine, and I'm also I'm the museum assistant there, and then I'm also the state coordinator for National History Day in Maine. And I'll send it over to Rebecca.
Good morning. My name's Rebecca Tabor-Conover, and I work for the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and I am the state coordinator for Connecticut History Day.
Awesome. And we are so excited to have our two presenters with us here today. We have Scott and Maria Saracen from Rhode Island PBS. They're both producers. They're going to share all of their documentary knowledge with us. But before we turn it over to them, do we want to go over the logistics of webinar and how it works?
Sure. So just really quickly, and I know a lot of us are familiar with Zoom at this point, but the way that we will handle this is that participants won't be on camera at all, but if you do have questions, and we encourage questions, please keep them coming. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box, so you can enter your questions in there, and then also feel free to use the chat function as well. When you do chat, if you can make sure to select all panelists and attendees if you do want everyone to be able to see what you're saying. And we will just take the questions as you come, and I think Sam is going to be moderating those.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Alyssa. So Scott and Maria, I will turn it over to you. If you can give us a little brief overview of that recorded presentation you shared with everyone, we'll make available for all the attendees again as well. And then we'll get started fielding questions.
Awesome. Great. So I'll just say hi and thank you so much for having us, and we're excited to be here with you guys this morning. I'll let Maria start off the presentation as she did. That's my little
Thanks. And I hope our memories serve us well as we go over this. But I think the first thing that comes to mind regarding the presentation and what participants should keep in mind is to really explore your options before you settle on a theme. So whenever we're choosing documentary topics, when we have that luxury, we don't always have that. Sometimes we get told this is what you're doing. But I think it's really great to explore your options for students to pursue what they're interested in as well, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with whatever topic it is that you ultimately choose. And so if you're interested in it, it's definitely going to help, and it's going to show in how you, reflect the topic and how you make your documentary. And any other tips you can think of?
Well, in the video, I talk about more of the technical side of things and, what you need. A computer with it, with an edit system, and I kind of stress that it doesn't really matter which edit system. That gets kind of tossed around a lot these days, which is better, and honestly it doesn't matter. It matters that you know and feel comfortable with what you're using. Also, a camera, if you're going to go out and shoot interviews, you just want something that you're comfortable with and you know how to use it. I think one of the requirements for the contest is that you are familiar with equipment, so that's a pretty good
and
thing.
Honestly, when we're talking about cameras in this day and age, it can be a phone. That's perfectly acceptable, and you just have to make sure that your phone is set at its best settings, because often it's not. So you just have to make sure it is the highest quality you can be recording with that phone that you have. But it doesn't have to be any expensive camera that you go out and buy. So don't let that be an intimidating factor. And then a microphone is very important too. So, and that you wouldn't recommend like a phone microphone, correct?
No, I mean, if you can have an external mic that you plug into whatever device you're using, and a lapel mic is always great so you can get close, or a boom microphone, which would be just out of frame. just to make sure that what you hear is very important in the storytelling world. It's more important than what you see. So, just something to stress on. But an
interesting fact, which may not be intuitive, is that audiences will forgive bad video more than they will forgive bad audio. So that is a really important thing to remember. Your audio needs to be good, and microphones aren't terribly expensive either.
No,
they run the gamut. Obviously you can go to thousands of dollars, but if you're a student and you're working on a tight budget, absolutely you can find something that's good quality and that is very affordable.
Choosing a topic, and I know the 10-minute timeline is kind of an important thing that people stress, and Maria had some good information about how to whittle down your topic, because these things can get really big. We mentioned earlier that we're working on a 3-hour documentary that spans 189 years. So believe it or not, 3 hours is just that's whittling it down.
It's very short.
For us. So in 10 minutes,
we honestly have over 100 hours of interviews that we've done for that documentary. And then of course we have our script to go along with it. So we know what it's like to have to cut. And my technique, which I did go over in the video, but maybe I can just do a little bit more in depth, is, to go into the edit system. And for my first cut, I don't force myself to be that judicious. Anything that sounds good, I obviously cut my own questions out, but anything that sounds good, I put in the timeline. And that kind of gives me a bit of breathing room and doesn't put any pressure on me to feel like I have to choose right off the bat. And then I just duplicate that sequence and I cut it down a bit more, but knowing I always have the original. So it never feels like a really hard and fast commitment. If I'm cutting something out, I can always go back. And I might end up with like 5 or 7 cuts at the end of it, where I have just whittled it down. And it's really important, to make changes on the correct cut. So obviously if you're working with a lot of them, you need to know what your most recent one is so you don't make any mistakes. But that's how I kind of address cutting something huge into whatever length it has to be. And, between those cuts, I won't do it obviously all in one day. It might not even be all in 1 month. And I think it really helps to walk away from your project for a little bit, just to get that clarity, to come back with fresh eyes. And then ultimately we will get either, when we're working together, the other one typically hasn't been like really into the edit. And so Scott can come with fresh eyes and say, oh, that needs to go, or that was more important. But we also ask our colleagues to come in and watch it, even if they're not in any way related to the project. If there's someone whose opinion we value, we'll say, please watch it. And then that way we get a new perspective on what's really important and what isn't in the story.
And I just wanted to jump, but even before that, especially if you're doing interviews, one thing that we can't stress enough is really important. You want to be familiar with this material. If you shoot an interview, you want to watch it over and over again. You want to you almost want to memorize it. So you're going to go back and, oh yeah, there was that part they talked about this, and I can grab from it and put it in. So you feel comfortable. When you just shoot an interview, oftentimes you're just busy asking the questions and you're not really paying attention to what they're saying. And then if you never go over it, you're ready for the edit. You're just not going to know where to go. Yeah. So
it's really called logging your footage. Yeah. So you basically just go back and watch it and you take note of all the good parts so that when you do go into the edit, you know what you want to use. And
the same with obviously, researching your topic, just be as familiar as possible. I know there are a lot of videos they won't have interviews. They'll just be narration. And so it's, reading books, scouring the internet, reaching out to professors and to experts, and to get as much knowledge as possible. So, arm yourself with all the knowledge you can.
Is it okay if we keep going?
Yes, please. This is great.
So, you know, as far as the research goes, that's really important. Obviously, I think it's obvious to everyone why it would be important. But before you do your interview, as I mentioned in the presentation, that interviewees really appreciate it when you ask them good questions and that you know their topic. And that's how you really get the best stuff out of them, is because if you're just asking the very basic questions, it won't be as deep, it won't be as information rich as it could be if you did that research beforehand and came up with juicy questions. And also watching any interviews that your potential interviewees have done in the past is really helpful. In terms of narration, okay, so I know for the National History Day project, the students themselves have to do the narration. And this is, I work with many voiceover actors, and it's something that there's a reason it's a profession, and you pay people to do this, because getting the right voice for your project is very important. So if you have to do it, some really important points are to, first of all, the script should be more conversational than academic in our experience. So, you know, writing a report is one thing, but writing for a documentary is far more conversational than maybe people might think. So really try to, you know, not be too lofty, not have, you know, sentences that are too long, make it conversational, and also, you know, don't kind of read it in a monotone voice, don't drone on, but also don't gallop through your script, because those are kind of the two extremes that I often see when people do their own narration. So really go for a comfortable pace. And if you have to practice a couple times, and if you have to let other people hear it and give you feedback, and then you redo it, that's okay too, because professional voiceover actors are coached often by the producer or the director. So don't feel like you're not doing a good job just because you didn't nail it the first time. It's part of the process, and that is really important to the watchability of your documentary.
Awesome. That was fantastic. Thank you. I was going to say too, I think one of the things that I found really helpful in watching your video is that you have it split up into those 3 parts. And I think sometimes students can go into it and it just seems like this huge project of like, I have to do all this background work and then make, like you say, this really whittled down product that's very concise, but also, you know, gets a point across. So I think breaking it up into the pre-production, production, and post-production is super helpful. So I appreciated that. Thank you for doing that. But thinking about that first part in pre-production, and we're talking about research and things, I really liked the one tip you shared where you said, brainstorm as many ideas that come to mind, just write them, you know, don't try to filter now, just kind of let it flow. But even when you start researching, new ideas might come up, and that's okay. Yeah, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's kind of a rabbit hole, I found, when you start doing research for one topic. And yeah, this is the beauty of this particular project, is that you can choose. So as you follow things that interest you, many new topics might pop up. And go and explore those as well. Obviously, you don't want to be paralyzed by, you know, so many options and so much research, but also don't limit yourself. You know, give yourself a certain amount of time, however, you know, long it seems reasonable to do so, a couple days or a week or whatever it may be, to kind of mull things over, write down ideas, and then kind of start the selection process. And one other tip we had was, you know, if your topic is very visual, that is going to be an advantage in the documentary genre, because that's what documentaries are. They're very visual. And so we're working on a project right now, like Scott said, it's 89 years. Who's counting? But apparently he did. But so that's how long of a period it spans. And so the early period is very challenging for us because there's no video, there are no photos. It's all like illustrations. And then we kind of have to go and do reenactments for it. Whereas the more recent years are like, we're just spoiled for choice. So that's just something to keep in mind. And if students are willing to be extremely creative and come up with ideas to tell a story that doesn't really have anything to show for it, that's great. But just keep that in mind and decide whether you are willing to go to those lengths.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll make a plug for yesterday's presentation as well. Dr. Libby Bashoff from the Osher Map Library in Maine was talking about kind of visual literacy in general and how important it is when you're picking visuals to make sure that they're there for a reason. So, you know, you want a visual topic, but you also want to have these visuals that make sense and are helping to tell your story. So everyone out there, watch both sessions. These two talk to each other really well. All right, we had a question come in from one of our attendees, Jay. So Jay is asking, they write, we often struggle giving kids feedback on getting the narration related to the heart of the documentary, but also keeping it in dialogue fashion. Any advice on that?
So I'm not sure if I'm totally understanding, like keeping by dialogue fashion, does he mean like conversational or?
That's how I'm interpreting it as well. Jay, feel free to type in the chat or more in the Q&A if you want to explain a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, like Maria said, it's not easy to coach somebody through, you know, speaking, because you tend to want to read rather than it's pretty much like acting and what you're doing when you're reading narration. And so to emote, I know Maria often encourages more energy, even when you as the narrator are speaking and you feel like you're putting too much energy, it often isn't enough and you come across straight and monotone.
Yeah.
I think, what are some tips you give?
So I'm just wondering if the question is also kind of asking about the writing of the script and the style of writing. And so if that is what he's referring to, Jay, let me see.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a follow-up.
He has a follow-up here.
Oh, we're always trying to stuff in the hint. Okay, to fully tell the whole story. Okay,
right.
So the thing about, okay, great. So the thing about talking about history is it doesn't have to be dry. And there are some really good resources online where you can look at scripts that have been written for documentaries. So I'm thinking like American Experience, right? Which is on PBS. You can actually go and look up some of those scripts. Am I correct in saying that? Because it's been a while since I've done this, but Ken Burns has some scripts. So you can, you know, have your students look those up or have some examples on hand where you'll notice, like for our documentary, how does it start? We have terrible memories, by the way. We'll just full disclaimer here. But it was like, it was a hot summer.
It was 1847 in Providence, Rhode Island, as the hot summer sun streamed through the factory windows at 12 Steeple Street. Jabez Gorham, one of the city's premier makers of silver, was ready to call it quits. I'll just jump in. I didn't need to read all that, but I think the whole idea is at the end, all of this is telling a story. We want to tell stories. And the history is obviously the main factor here. And we want to get those facts out. We want to get the dates and everything correct. But we have to engage the viewer in this. And so by thinking more in a storytelling sense, in an entertaining storytelling sense, and peppering in the facts, you know, so it's not like you're reading a book or not a book, but, you know, an academic journal. It's not easy. I mean, it's not something you can just. But
there is a large part of creative writing involved in this, like, you know, the descriptions and trying to put people in the scene. I love using contractions and things like that, where it's not, you know, informal writing, but just it's more casual. And
I think that the other side of the line you really have to be careful is you don't want to embellish things. You never want to, you know, say somebody's doing something when we have no idea if they did that or not. You know, I know sometimes just to make the story interesting, I've seen even very professional documentaries do this, and it's a fine line to walk. So you want to make sure you're keeping the facts straight, you're telling the true history where it is, but give some life to it. And that's where research comes in. You know, that opening line, I had to make sure it was the summer, it was, you know, this was going on, these are the things that were happening. And luckily we had diaries to work with that they actually told, you know, what was going on. So it helps. Yeah.
And even, you know, with our interviewees, we've interviewed a lot of academics for this particular documentary we've done. And sometimes they feel like they have to be very academic. But when you compare the interviews, it's the people that are just telling a story that are the most engaging to watch. So yeah, it's not something that, you know, a lot of people can just intuitively do. It's definitely honing the craft and maybe rewriting your script multiple times. I mean, we've done that ourselves. You know, you do the first draft, and that's really the documentary process, is you have many, many drafts that you keep refining as you go along.
And part of that refining, I'll just jump in quick, is going over with your student and saying, okay, is it necessary to have this statistic, this fact, this date in there? Because sometimes it does feel like every other line is a date. And you just, the viewer gets fatigued by the amount of factual information. So how necessary is that to your story? And that's where cut out things that just don't move it along. You just want to, you want to be able to move the story along and get the important facts out there, but make it engaging.
And speaking to that, because we do have a lot of dates in ours, it's sometimes you might, you know, mention a date to kind of set the scene, but then you go 4 years later, or, you know, not, sorry, I don't know if you can hear our dog. He's kind of complaining. He's not in the office. I'm making all kinds of groans. But so anyway, you know, you try to creatively explain what time period it was, but not necessarily with mentioning, you know, August 15th, 1973 or whatever.
Can I ask you a question? One of the new things that they've mentioned in the new rule book that NHT has put together is there's an emphasis on student voice. And so you were talking about how you have interviewed a lot of academics, and you want to use the stories that they're telling to push the story along, but at the same time you want to have your own voice in that script, and not having them tell the story completely, right? So is there any tips on how to use interviews in such a way to where you still have a voice in the script?
Absolutely. And I think the best way is when there's a balance of both, because you know, people can definitely waffle on. We're probably examples of that right now. So you want to distill the best parts of what they're saying. And that might just be like a 10-second soundbite. And using the narration, so the student's voice, to paraphrase a lot of information and maybe to make it more interesting or more storyteller-like. That is the opportunity they have for expressing their voices, I would say.
Yeah. I think on that note too, I know the new rule book is emphasizing interviews versus oral histories. And I think it's important that we just lay out here, the emphasis isn't so much on, for me, how I'm interpreting it, please feel free to jump in, fellow coordinators, but is, you know, less of an emphasis on interviewing historians in place of doing the research yourself. So like you should read that historian's book rather than asking the historian to tell you the story. But if you're doing, you know, a project, the student we're going to talk to later, one of their projects was on a puffin colony in Maine. If you want to talk to that scientist, that's a great interview to include. So kind of differentiating like who would be a good interview topic for the subject.
First person versus third person.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that makes sense. Yeah.
And actually, I want to just, you know, jump on what you said there with interviewing somebody who wrote a book. Let's say we actually came across people that we had to fact check and found out that they gave wrong information in their interview. And that's why it is very important to do as much research as possible and look at as many different
sources.
I mean, we found books that were actually printed that were wrong in the information. So
yeah,
do your research.
Yeah.
Don't rely on what one person says.
Yeah.
Try to get, and
Yeah.
this is different voices, and do your research to get your voice in there as well.
And in the past, I may have thought, well, if it's printed, it must be true. But it's you know, as we've discovered, yeah,
Yeah.
Scott just said. So yeah, there can be discrepancies. So, and you may have to ultimately be the judge of what is the correct information. And you can even say that, you know, you can mention that there are conflicting sources, but to the best of our knowledge, this is what we believe is true. Or if it's not that important, don't mention it if there's no conclusive evidence to, you know, for whatever it is.
And to your students, we always recommend watching documentaries as much as possible. And like, I love, Maria mentioned American Experience on PBS. It's a wonderful historical documentary series. And watch the way they write, how they get around certain things. Like you said, you know, it is often said, or it's possibly known that this or that. So you're not locking yourself into, you know, saying that something happened when maybe it didn't.
Yeah.
And just to jump into what Samantha said, I was really glad you brought up the new rules and the kind of de-emphasizing asking historians, because I have seen what, and John kind of already stole my thunder with my question I was going to ask. Great minds think alike. But you know, I have seen documentaries that students have done, and I've given students feedback where literally I would say 6 to 7 minutes is an interview with one person. And, you know, this person was an eyewitness, but I, you know, told them that, you know, obviously that is just way too much. It's not an interview, it's a documentary. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, you know, do you have kind of a rough estimate of, if you were doing a 10-minute documentary, let's say, how much of it would you give to interviews? You know, how would you break that up in terms of time-wise so that it felt balanced?
You know, it's interesting working in this medium for many years. It actually is a rhythm you get used to of how you come in and out of things. And sometimes you're sitting there listening to something, and this could even just be narration, and you're like, I need a break here. I need a different voice. I need something. And so that's one part, is when you're watching, you know, and listening to an interview, does it kind of go on and you feel like I need to go somewhere else? And, you know, can it be broken up? Is it something that are they talking about one specific topic and it's going on for 6 minutes? And, you know, is there a place you can come out? And
if
so
you don't
many
mind me
times
jumping in. So we've done documentaries that have had absolutely no narration. It's all interview. But I would say a rule of thumb is that people don't speak for minutes on end. In fact, we're usually talking seconds. What's that?
I said except us.
Yeah, no, this isn't a documentary, but we're usually talking seconds of how long you see someone on screen. And if I'm making a documentary where there is no narration, we make sure that we interview as many people as possible. And you almost can get people finishing each other's sentences, like, you know, or at least filling in parts of the story, so that it never feels like it's just droning on and on and on and it's boring. The other thing is, if somebody's talking, you can always cover them with B-roll. And that really helps because you don't have to just have the person on the screen. Most of the time we don't. We have them up long enough to have like a name key so people know who they are. And then as much as we can, unless it's very emotional and they're crying or there's a reason to see them on screen, most of the time we cover them up as best as we can with B-roll. So
and you know, this is also to get back to the point of whittling down your time. This is a great way to take a minute's worth of information that your interviewer said and bring it down into a 10-second narration bite, you know.
Sound bite.
We've done that. We do that all the time as well, just to kind of, or, you know, to steer the story in the direction you want it to go.
So you mentioned that, you know, you suggest that students look at other documentaries, and you suggested American Experience, which is a great series, of course. Are there any specific documentarians you would suggest them to seek out? I mean, there's obviously Ken Burns, but
I mean, it's tough in the historical documentary. no one specific comes to
Mm.
mind. I look
And
more
there
at
are
the,
lots of good documentaries like on Netflix that we could
yeah.
talk about, but those aren't really historical. It's different topics. So honestly, yeah, American Experience is the best one that comes to mind.
And there, several different directors and producers on that.
I mean, I'd be happy to provide a link to an example of something we've done. We've done a couple of shorts. So I'm thinking of the Native American series. There was a national Native America show, and we did some local segments that are very short. So it will give you an example of how you can do something short with multiple interviews, and there's no narration. So that's, just as an example.
And, Gary Glassman was the producer for that, and he's actually a Rhode Island native, but he does national, international programming, and he does a lot of Nova and more science-based stuff, but Native America was a different look at, the Native Americans before the settlers came, and
it's
a
beautiful,
very interesting. So
series,
I'd recommend taking a look at that.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So when thinking about, putting all of these pieces together, if you're, let's say I've seen, student documentaries where they'll put, a quote or some information that's maybe a few sentences on the screen. How long would you suggest that stay up so people can read it? Or how long do you need to see a photo on the screen so it doesn't feel like you're flying through a slideshow? Is there like a best practice timing for that sort of thing?
For a quote, typically if you put a quote on the screen, somebody would either be reading it, whether it's the person being interviewed rather, or more likely the narration. So I would say have it up as long as it takes to read it out. I would never put something up that looks like it should be read, but without the voiceover accompanying it. I wouldn't say never, but usually I would have voiceover accompanying it. Certainly not, I wouldn't put a quote up if something else is being said at the same time.
Well, sometimes we can lead into a documentary with a quote from somebody famous, and generally you sit there in your head, you read it, and how long does it take you to read? Maybe add an extra second or something. Especially in historical documentaries, we tend to go slower, let people process. There's a lot of information, a lot of dates we're giving people. So we want to make sure that the pictures stay up long enough. And it's amazing. We're so used to watching video and moving images that our brains are just going like this. And when you can, and this is a Ken Burns thing right here, when you can just sit on a photo and realize the detail in there, and you can see this photo from 1870, and you're looking, and you're not just looking at the general part of it, the person sitting there, but all of a sudden you start looking behind them and all the details, and it really can draw the viewer in, and it kind of is a more settling, comforting way to experience the documentary. So I do recommend let the viewer watch these photos, especially if you have really good stuff to show, and let it settle. Don't just hit them as fast as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Oh, go ahead, John.
You mentioned, sit on a photo and look at it visually. And one of the things that I've always found that can get very hard to watch when watching NHD documentaries are the students who'd like to do the pan over and over and over. Are there any suggestions that if you're gonna focus in on a visual, to not constantly have that panning?
So, one of the things, and this is like a preset on a lot of these edit systems, if you just hit it, it kind of just does a fast zoom in or pan or something. And we always slow it down. So it's very subtle. How would you do it with a cinematic camera? Just real subtle. And again, Ken Burns is a great example of how to do this. Yeah. And sometimes you can even just stay still, just let it settle, and then do a nice dissolve to it.
Yeah, I think simple dissolves are usually pretty fail-safe, and also just very slow movements. You don't want speed. And a lot of times people are tempted to use the kitchen sink in terms of the effects in the edit system, flying boxes and stars
and
and
yeah.
wipes and sparkles and yeah, it's fun to do that, but do that as a separate project.
Yeah.
And your actual documentary, don't add all those things in. Yeah.
Don't distract. That's it. You're trying to tell a story and engage the viewer. You want them to be listening, and the visuals are just kind of complementing everything. And if you're doing flying boxes really quick, it just takes you out of it. So
yeah,
definitely recommend against that stuff.
Yeah. So I think, what we're saying with like letting the picture settle and you don't want flying boxes, we're thinking a lot about the experience of the person watching your documentary. And another thing that I loved that you said in your video was the positive effect a pause can have. It can be dramatic and it can evoke emotion. And I think music can do that too. Can you talk a little bit about using those things to kind of get a certain response or a certain thought process with your viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So don't be afraid of pauses, especially if you're transitioning from one, idea or topic to another one. Pauses can be nice. Fades to black, we sometimes use, like, a nice dissolve to black and then dissolve up. That could be a technique you use. You don't have to. Music is definitely very powerful, and the music you choose, there's just so much great music out there that's royalty free, and you want to make sure you're using music legally, just like images. But just think about what is it that the emotion that you want to evoke, and chances are you'll find a good piece of music to help you do that. One thing is, obviously, for the most part, the music should be subtle, especially under voiceover or interviews, but it can peak at certain times for emphasis, but don't make it blaringly loud the whole way through. It's, really should be used as a tool to, like you're a conductor, and you're moving that emotion along. Some people might say it's a bit manipulative, and it can be. Music can definitely manipulate emotions. So again, you also want to use it thoughtfully, and just really, how do you want the audience to feel? I think that's the question with everything that you're putting into your documentary. How do you want the audience to feel and to respond?
Does it fit with the topic? If you have some heavy metal music going and you're doing the Dust Bowl, it may work. Who knows? There's many different styles. But just make sure that it goes.
Yeah. If you're going for creative, just make sure it works. Yeah.
But yeah, and to go along with just the pauses, I think we see this a lot on the professional end, as well as I'm sure with students. You have so much information you want to get in to that 10 minutes that you just go start to finish, and it's just talking.
Yes.
And those pauses and those breaks are vital to letting your audience, letting the viewer process the information you just unleashed on them. So, let them just have a little break, and you're looking at a photograph now and you're thinking about the information. So pauses are really important.
And sorry, not to belabor the point, but that is a very important point, because I've watched many of these short documentaries, and I think people are galloping through because there's just such a short amount of time, but less is more in most cases, and those pauses are so important.
Yeah. And I think that gets back to your point earlier too, of having a fresh set of eyes kind of looking at it. Like, you'll get that true reaction, and are people processing the information if you've got somebody fresh kind of looking at it and being willing to give you honest feedback, which is of course important.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah, definitely. Kate, go ahead.
I just want to first of all remind all of our teachers that if you have any questions, please toss them into the chat or in the Q&A. We're keeping an eye on them. And Scott and Maria, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about your process for choosing some of those images. And what was really interesting about the session we mentioned yesterday was the way that our expert talked about doing sort of deep analysis of some of those images. And I was wondering if you could also talk about sort of how do you pick the ones that you want to match the narration, and do you ever pause to really spend time picking through and focusing in on the image as opposed to having it go along with what you're kind of telling, and how do you shift gears like that?
So I would say that the narration, so whether it's the interview or the voiceover, is what is governing what we're showing.
Well, yeah, I mean, so as far as a lot of times when we're picking images, especially historical documentaries that go, you know, way back, you don't have too much, we don't have too much to choose from. So, and especially high resolution. So we're looking for whatever is the best quality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we do, let's say we have a plethora to choose from, then we're gonna want to find an image that, again, that goes along with what we're saying and that people can kind of get into the details and like that. One thing I will say, I don't like to, somebody says something and that image just pops up, and then they say a name and that image pops up. It has to be subtle. You want things to kind of come in a little before or a little after, and at a slower pace, maybe dissolved in. And that's one thing you have to be aware, that you don't want to just
it doesn't have to be cut. And like Ken Burns is a perfect example to watch, because you'll have just the scene of a cannon on a field for like forever.
Yeah.
and so like if that's what we all need to have permission to stay on an image, go watch Ken Burns. But yeah, so it shouldn't be cut. But I think often it's kind of an intuitive thing. You look at the images at your disposal. Number one is the quality of the image, because you might have a beautiful image, but if it's small and it's going to end up being very pixelated, that's completely out of the question, unfortunately. And then from what you do have, I don't know that I have a very
like a
formal process of choosing it, besides, ooh, I like that. You know, it just kind of just whatever sticks out to me is what I would use, and that's relevant.
And just as a quick question for those of us who are less technologically inclined when it comes to doing documentaries, but could you just remind everyone what you mean by dissolve?
Sure. So it's basically an effect that edit systems have, where you have two images next to each other, and it just helps you transition between them. So one fades out while the other one's fading up. So that's one way. A fade to black would be one totally fades out, it's black, and then it fades, the next one fades up. But a dissolve is they're kind of crossing over each other. So that.
Thank you, that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, speaking of, you know, good quality images, generally we're working in HD format, which is like 1920 by 1080. So you want your image to look good in that size. And if you can get an even larger image, and the resolution for television is 72 DPI. You don't need 300 DPI. So it doesn't have to be print quality, but it has to be 72 DPI. So that's like the minimum. And if you can get something bigger than that, that's even better, because then you can do like slow zooms in and zooms out, or pans or whatever. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, we had a question come in from one of our teachers. Christine says, this is the first year that my students will be working with documentaries. Some students have an iPhone and can use iMovie, but others will be using a Chromebook. Can you recommend a program that is user-friendly for those who are new to this category?
I will defer to you.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know how schools are set up, if they have, I guess they're probably going to be doing this on their own Chromebooks. And so specific edit systems, all the big ones have either some kind of a free basic version or a very inexpensive student discount version. The big edit systems are Avid, Adobe, Premiere, and Apple's Final Cut Pro 10, which if they're using a Chromebook, they wouldn't be using that. But there's also Sony Vegas. But I would say to try out one of these free or lower cost versions. And again, you don't need a program with all the bells and whistles. You don't need these high-end edit systems. You need to just be able to cut your story together. And I think even I'm a Mac guy. I'm sorry, I don't know much about Windows, but I believe they had like Windows Movie Maker, which was a basic, came installed with the program. But look around for free, even download a trial version and have them practice and see if they can cut on it. I think the kids nowadays are so quick at picking this stuff up. So
yeah, I'll say too, I know a lot of my past Rhode Island documentary students also use WeVideo, and you can do that online, I believe. You don't have to like download something to your computer. You do that online with the free version. You'll get the watermark, but that's okay. You don't get marked down in your judging for having a watermark. Fantastic. So let's see, we've had another pop up. Oh, Christine said, thank you. Perfect, cool.
Sam, I have a question. If
yeah,
if you don't
please.
mind. So in a lot of the documentaries that I've seen, of course, students struggle with the 10-minute limit. That's always really hard. And they often tend to end abruptly. So I didn't know if you had any suggestions for, like, what's the best way to end the documentary? What do you like to see?
It's really good.
Yeah.
One of the things I think we generally do is when we're first getting into something, we think about our beginning and ending, and you kind of think of how, and then you fill in the sandwich, if you will. But you always want something that's going to capture your viewer immediately in the beginning, and you want to have something that stays with your viewer after they leave in the ending. So I think it's really important right from the get-go to think, how do I want to end this? And then filling it in.
And when, if you do an interview, just kind of keep your ears open for a very powerful statement. That is a way I like to end something. And then you fade to black slowly. You don't just boom, you're done. You want to just let it sink in, whatever the person is saying. And hopefully it doesn't have to be emotional, but if it is something that's kind of very emotional or that leaves the viewer with a statement or even an important question, that's really powerful. So we're always listening out for that. If it's going to end with narration, same thing. You can really make it powerful and make a closing statement about whatever your topic is about, and try and make it creative writing, impactful, and just, something that'll stay with the viewer. So.
I mean, unfortunately, due to time constraints on everything, you see how you have these nice slow ramp ups, and then you're like, oh, I'm at the end and I got to fill in the rest of the 100 years in that last minute. So I mean, I think it's being thoughtful from the beginning when you're doing your pre-production, your planning, that you are thinking about how I'm going to have a beginning and an ending, and how am I going to get from point A to point B, spacing it out as evenly as possible while getting that information in. I think it's really important to be thoughtful of that, and that's hopefully how they can do it.
Yeah, that's great. So Rebecca typed in a question. She said, I've often seen documentaries that reuse the same images several times to the point that it's very obvious and repetitive. What is your rule of thumb for reusing images?
Try not to. That is our rule of thumb.
I mean, look, we have, for instance, our documentary we're working on now. I mean, we have a 3-hour documentary, and we have, some of our main players in this, the founders of the company, we only have 1 or 2 images. So what do? So we try to be creative. Sometimes you can, if it's a large photo, you can have a wide shot, and then the next time you show it a little closer. But that's it. You have to be creative and think different ways to show different things.
I mean, hopefully there are many images at your students' disposal, and they wouldn't be forced to repeat an image, but that is a great example of what Scott had mentioned. And so, for instance, with our characters, one guy is in all 3 episodes, and we have 1 image of him. So what we've had to do is literally go and do reenactments. And you have to be careful with reenactments, because sometimes they can be a little bit cheesy, and you don't want them to look silly or out of place and out of context with the rest of your documentary. Scott actually happens to look very much like the guy, so he was our actor, which came in really handy at these COVID times. We didn't have to hire another actor.
I did have a handlebar mustache and a beard at the time.
He did. And then costuming and all that. But, you know, most likely in this instance, students wouldn't have to go to that extent. But if it says, you know, you're talking about the person writing a letter or doing things where you could just maybe film somebody writing, whether it's with a fountain pen, if it's a historical context, or even a quill pen, whatever, just tight shots where you can give an impression of what it is that you're talking about, but maybe don't have to use that image over and over. They're like creative variations you can come up with.
And, you know, look for stock footage. I mean, we find a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I don't know if that's permitted though in this project. Is stock footage permitted?
Yeah,
Like,
I believe it is.
The National Archives and Library of Congress, you can find some really great materials that can help tell the story. And again, rather than seeing the same image over and over again, think it could even be something abstract you just show, because the viewer's going to be more forgiving that they're not seeing that person that you're talking about at that time. They're listening to the story you're telling, and just something that can accompany it. But yeah, try not to use it over and over again.
Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to this series so we can see Scott in a handlebar mustache.
Wish it was bigger. But
That's great. I'm wondering too, because right now we've said you're working on this documentary about Gorham Silver, which of course is a local Rhode Island topic. For National History Day, students can literally pursue any kind of history, world history, American history. But of course, I think we all like to push local topics. They tend to be, I think, a little more original and things like that. Can you talk about that experience in comparison to maybe other historical documentaries you've done and what it's like to do a more local story?
So to be honest with you, because we're working for Rhode Island PBS, everything has been local for us with our documentaries.
We try to, a lot of the things we do though, they are local, but they have a national appeal. For instance, Gorham Silver, it was one of the largest silver manufacturers in the world, you know, during their heyday. And they, you know, it was them and Tiffany going for silver. So, you know, we've done others that, you know,
we did, our first one was Ghosts and Vampire Legends of Rhode Island back in 2002. So yeah, that was fun.
But it was a historical take on these, you know, what they called vampires, and they were, it was actually tuberculosis that. But so anyway, we won't get into that. But yeah, we try to find topics, if it's local, that can have a bit of a national appeal to it, or you know that.
But the beauty of local is that it's accessible. It's nice to kind of celebrate your local geography, and it's more like the resources are more readily available. It's cost effective, all of that good stuff.
And a compelling story is a compelling story no matter where it's from.
Yes, exactly.
Can you give some examples of some resources that you've used that might be extraordinary, or just something that you didn't think could have been used in a documentary that you ended up using and it turned out really well? Anything off the top of your head like that?
So I can tell you our local historical society has been amazing. So thank you, Sam. Libraries, but I think those are your usual suspects. For us, it's been more reenactments, recreations of scenes. We did a documentary about a lady that lives in Rhode Island, but she grew up in Vietnam, and she didn't go to school, but she would practice writing in the dirt. And one of our favorite shots ever was basically my hand writing in the dirt, but Scott filmed it in a way that, and just put like an effect on it. It just looked like it was old footage, and it, you know, so I think those are kind of the more resourceful and creative things we've turned to.
But also, I mean, talk to people about your topic, and it's amazing how you find people that, you know, your aunt knows somebody that worked at the company or whatever you're, you know,
That's true. Yeah.
or knows some history about, and you might find ways and depending on your topic, I mean, people might have old photographs, film reels, or something related to your topic in their attic, you know. So I think the more you look, the wider you put
cast
that,
your net.
cast your net, then, you know.
Yeah. So I guess don't be shy to tell your friends and family what you're doing, and you never know who will like say, hey, you know. And for us, people are going, hey, I have Gorham silver, or I have this, I have that, and it's great. Yeah. So
that's great. I think too, in thinking about you know, reaching out to people and sharing what you're doing, have you ever had to just kind of cold call or cold email somebody for an interview, and what advice do you have in doing that?
All the time. All the time. Hi, my name's Maria Saracen. You know,
I was going to say, for the most part, people are pretty excited to be part of, you know, a documentary or television or something. And so it's this day and age, it's usually an email, but cold calling is really good because you can speak to the person and find out if there's somebody, if you do want them on in your program to be interviewed, how do they come across, you know, are they a good storyteller, a good speaker? But I mean, some tips to, you know.
I think, you know, people who I'm friends with who are not in the documentary world or, you know, this type of work, they often get intimidated by cold calling. But again, like Scott said, most people are very kind and accommodating, and they will, if there's any reservation, it's usually because they're nervous to be on camera. You know, so it's never anything personal, I would say, or never. So that's mainly the main hesitation. And then of course, just schedules, you know, working out. But I would say for the students to make a list and, you know, aim high and don't feel like anyone is out of bounds. You know, you can always approach them. If you get a no, go to the next person on your list. And also I would encourage students not to just choose one person, but to get as many voices as they possibly can, obviously within their time frame and resources. But the more people you can have telling a story, I think the more colorful and interesting it is to watch and listen to. So and
I want to tell your students, I think beyond that, I think especially being students and doing, you know, documentaries, don't be afraid to reach out to professional documentary filmmakers. Look at television stations or local historians or local filmmakers in your area and say, hey, I'm making this. Can you offer me some advice or some help? And we were there. We've all been there. And I think there's more people in our industry willing to share, especially with students, to see this industry grow and continue to be a bastion of, you know, factual history and to give advice. So don't be afraid to reach out. I think it's very important to keep that line of communication open.
Awesome. So just a reminder again, any other questions you have, please feel free to throw them in. I do want to ask you all, do you have a favorite documentary? I'm sure that's a tough question, but are there any, like, what aspects of it make it your favorite? Why do you love it?
Oh my goodness.
You know, a lot of times what your favorite, from what my favorite is when I'm doing a documentary like we're doing now and I'm focused on something that's similar. And there was an American Experience, The Gilded Age was something that I kept going back to. But I'm going to just keep repeating American Experience, but they have such wonderful ones. The Circus was fantastic. You know, there's a whole number of them. I think you can't go wrong with any of those. And then of course Ken Burns. Ken Burns it's a lot bigger, and I know some people have a hard time because it can be, you know, investment of 8 hours of a topic to get into, but you can definitely get some good information out of.
Yeah, he's a good storyteller. But yeah, I ditto what Scott said, and American Experience has some amazing topics and things you just never knew about. One of them we recently started watching was The Poison Squad. And that's about, you know, things that were in our food. And like it's fascinating. So it's funny because often, even as documentary filmmakers, you often go, do I feel like getting into a documentary? It's, 8 o'clock. Do I really want it? But then when you start watching, it just grabs you and you're like, why didn't I watch this sooner? So, and I guess that's the hallmark of a good documentary. Like it might sound like it's like a bit like homework or a chore, but it's actually, a lot of them are very gripping and fascinating. Yeah.
And I say watch it twice, because especially if you're doing it for research, because if it's a good documentary, you're going to get lost in it and you're going to enjoy it, and you're not going to be thinking how they did this or that. So enjoy it the first time, and then go back and then watch how did they go from here to here? What did they do at this
The transitions, the moves, the pacing. Yeah.
Awesome.
I was actually, I'm sorry, Sam.
No, go for it.
I was actually thinking about, because we keep bringing up Ken Burns, and you did mention earlier about different ways that you could put in tighter shots and then maybe like a wider shot if you're reusing a photo and everything like that. And I really started thinking about Ken Burns really does that quite a bit, especially in the first couple episodes of the baseball series.
Sure.
Because there's very little that they can go off of, and they really have to keep using those same static shots.
Yeah.
So I was just throwing it out there that if you really wanted to kind of see some examples, I think that series would be really good, at least the first couple of episodes.
And they named the effect after him, the Ken Burns effect, which just means to zoom in and out, because they literally had a film camera on these photographs that they were moving around, and they were zooming in live, and so that's how
this is back in the day. They don't do that now, but
not now, but yeah.
Well, do you have any suggestions on like camera angles or different shots that might have a better effect depending on either mood or emotion that you want or anything like that?
Are you talking about with interviews or just in general?
Yeah, interviews, I suppose. I think more of in general, but I think
the B-roll stuff. Yeah, you mentioned getting.
So oftentimes, sure, in the video, I said people like to see things from a different angle. You're either in a chair and you're looking at this height, or standing up and looking. It's a straight on, and so we often try to get either very low or high or angled shots to give the viewer something different to look at. And again, the only way I can say this stuff is to just watch other stuff that's been done. And again, time and time again, that's how we've gone.
Yeah, we do. We're like, ooh, we like that shot. Let's try to recreate something like that in our scene. Maybe having something really in focus in the foreground and out of focus in the background, or, vice versa. And,
keep it interesting, move your vantage point, and I think that automatically will give viewers a little more interest.
And I think anyone choosing this hopefully has an interest in documentary, and if you have an interest, you can make it fun. Like, this is a creative pursuit, so approach it in that way. It's wide open for you to make it whatever you want.
And one thing that I've kind of noticed with watching documentaries over the years, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, is also the importance of framing the person that you're interviewing. That's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Our nonprofit also runs the Connecticut Network, so I have TV production colleagues, and I watch documentaries a lot and cringe, but maybe if you could just talk a little bit about and give some tips for students about how to think about setting up that framing.
Sure. Obviously, there's many different ways you can shoot something, and as people get better, they try different, more experimental things. But I generally say the viewer wants to be comfortable watching, so we try not to have too much headroom. So if they're down here in the frame and it just feels awkward. Also, lighting is very important. If you can't see the eyes of your interviewee, then how can you
really connect
and trust what they say? So you want to have a nice, pleasing shot with lighting flat lighting on the face, so at least you can see.
Yeah, lighting's very important. Audio, as we mentioned, is very important. And then also where the person is in the frame. So I'm like, one rule of thumb is not to place someone straight in the middle, like dead center, if they're the only person there. That just feels a little awkward. It's better to have them off to one side. And generally, they wouldn't be staring straight at the camera and talking. Generally, they'd be a little bit off to the side speaking to whoever, you know, the interviewer is. All these rules can be broken, but they need to be broken for a good reason and thoughtfully. The other thing is, so you have the person kind of a little bit off to the side. They don't have to be as far in the frame as I am right now, but a little bit off from the center. And then looking in, like past the camera, this way, so that there's space here. I wouldn't be like this looking there. That would be very awkward. Yeah, that would be very uncomfortable. So those are basically the main rules.
You know, if you have multiple cameras, then that's great. You can get a wide shot. Oftentimes a really wide shot can show the location if a person is in that, you know, maybe you're doing a documentary about a house that's an old, you know, historical building and they're inside that setting. That's great, but just make sure you have another camera angle that's more of what we call a bust shot, that you can connect. It's almost a person-to-person feel with that person. So you don't want anything too tight either if that's the only camera you have. If you have multiple cameras, by all means, make sure you get your safety shot and then try different angles. A popular thing now is a complete side profile just to cut away. But
that helps you in your cuts in the interview. So let's say there's a very long period where they're speaking and you want to use this part, but then you want to skip all this and use that part. That helps if you have multiple angles. Another technique you can use, obviously you can use B-roll to hide the cut. But you can also, after you've finished your interview, you can ask them to just talk and you just film their hands, or you film just a detail. You could even, if they're, you know, their foot or whatever, you know, so that way, that's another way to cut away if you have cuts, so you can hide the cut between the interview. Yeah.
Those are excellent suggestions. Thank you. You talked about aiming high and trying to get interviews, you know, and see who you can get. Now, typically, if a student, say they are able to get an interview with, say, a senator or something like that, at this point, typically they're probably, especially during, you know, COVID right now, it's going to be over Zoom. So I don't know if there's actually an answer to this, but are there any suggestions on how they can make sure that that interview looks at least like
I do. Like I said, I work on a show that we are doing via Zoom every week, and it is a struggle every week because everybody has different internet connections, cameras, and all this. But I generally try to get them, just like you would with your camera, set a shot. And I think, you know, John, you're almost a perfect example of you're a bus shot, you've got a nice amount of headroom, and you're placed in a good, you know, section. I think that's try to get what you would shoot in your camera to have them tilt their screen around to get that. Usually I find the higher profile people, especially if they're in government, they have like a media handler or whatever. They're a little more savvy, so that hopefully should be good. But just have this checklist, I would say, you know, for the students. Make sure that the shot looks nice. Make sure you can hear them and the audio isn't cutting out. And if there is a problem, see if they can, you know, try plugging in a mic or wear headphones or something like that. And light, make sure there's enough proper light on their face. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that could very well be a possibility right now. Yeah.
And it's amazing. I mean, I never, you know, as a director of these studio shows, I cringe because my whole time is setting up the perfect shot with the perfect lighting. And then when we go on Zoom, everything is out the window. I have no more control. But I think viewers are now a lot more used to this style and they're forgiving. So.
Yeah, exactly. When we do go out to film people, we're 6 feet apart, and as the interviewer, we're wearing masks. The interviewee you know,
no.
but
That wouldn't work, but yeah.
But that may not be feasible right now. So Zoom will do it, or whatever they prefer, you know, Skype or whatever it is. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions for Scott and Maria? This has been wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Oh, we're glad. You're welcome.
All right. I don't see any other questions coming in. I know we covered a lot today, so just as a reminder to everybody, this is being recorded and we'll share it out at the end of all of our sessions. We'll give you all of the recordings, but you already have access to the presentation that Scott and Maria filmed for you that's documentary specific, so feel free to go back to that and, you know, review or refresh your memory or look a little deeper at some stuff that we covered today. John, did you want to jump in?
No, I'm just sitting here. So.
Okay, you were unmuted. I didn't know if you were going to jump in. No, it's all good. It's all good. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here, Scott and Maria. We really appreciate it.
For having us.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun. And we will send you the links just in case anyone wants to see what we were talking about with the Native American documentaries, no narration, just interviews.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, sure, right. Awesome. And we've got people in the chat just saying, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. This has been so helpful. Documentaries have always been my greatest challenge.
And I will point out that our speaker this afternoon, who is a student who won first place in nationals a few years ago, is actually one of the participants watching as well. So,
great. Congratulations. Yes. And yeah, thank you all. It's great being here. So, and good luck. Have a fun time this year.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.